Papers, papers. Read all about it. Read all about it. Extra, extra. Read all about it. Read all about it. Time to look at the headlines that you'll be waking up to this morning. I've been going through the front pages with student journalist Niamh McDermott.
Yeah, so yesterday Scotland approved the self-identification system, but last night and today the government is threatening it. So here's what's been in the papers today about it, and a few of them. The Telegraph says Westminster considers veto on Sturgeon's gender law. The Guardian says Number 10 threatens to block Scottish law on legally changing gender. The Daily Mail says SNP on collision course with Westminster after passing bill to let Scottish 16-year-olds change gender without medical diagnosis. And the ministers are threatening to block Sturgeon's gender law. And the Times as well, saying how the Westminster is threatening veto to the Scottish gender recognition law.
Yeah, it feels like this, and we'll come back to maybe the wider issue in a moment, but it feels like the way that the newspapers are pitching this story, which is a debate in the Scottish Parliament, the way that they're pitching it is Westminster. I do love the way you say Westminster, by the way, which is okay, fine, and a lot of people do. But for me, Westminster, that the Westminster, or as some people in Scotland might say, the English Parliament is being pitched against the Scottish Parliament in the way a lot of the papers are covering this story. Is that fair?
Yeah, I think that's definitely fair, Dotun. So I felt like the story yesterday was about the bill being passed and everything that's involved in, and that's still coming out today, and about the new rules. But today seems more about the kind of, like you says, how Westminster is threatening them and how they don't want this bill to go through. So I think that has changed slightly just within yesterday. But just to go through what kind of exactly it is for those who don't know. So Scotland yesterday approved a self-identification system for people who want to change their legal gender. So what gender recognition certificate is that if you want to change your affirmed gender or your acquired gender to be legally recognised in the UK. So it used to be that you have to do it under medical diagnosis for gender dysphoria and you had to be 18. But Scotland have now put through this bill that'll lower the age to 16, and it's the only nation in the UK to simplify the process of transitioning.
And of course, it's a debate in Scotland as well, because some women's groups are not in favour of this change.
Yeah, you're right. So basically what the kind of fighting with these women's groups as well is how that it's going to be a bit of a risk to possible vulnerable women and girls. And they did mention this in the Daily Telegraph, how they're worried that male predators may go for a sex change if it's considered easy. And they'll be preying on these vulnerable women, for example, in single-sex spaces, like in prisons or in changing rooms, which is the jeopardy.
Yeah, there are all sorts of other issues around this. In Edinburgh, for example, it's an issue that J.K. Rowling, the author, has been brought into at the very centre of. Well, I suppose for the last couple of years she's been in and around the issues of this, controversially or not. So the issue is at the very heart of perhaps a much deeper debate about the way that we navigate around this moment, I think. But if it now becomes an argument between the Scottish Parliament and the English Parliament, is there a risk of the issue being lost in all of this? Is the issue just too big to not be lost, if you see what I mean?
Yeah, I see what you mean. I personally think that it's not at risk to be lost because it's being talked about instantly. Like even moments after the legislation passed, and this is in the Daily Telegraph, Alistair Jack, the Scottish Secretary, did warn the government that they were considering invoking the Section 35 of the 1998 Scotland Act, which is seen as the nuclear option, which would be to ban the Scottish legislation if it was to believe to have this adverse effect on laws, which the UK Parliament has ultimately jurisdiction over. And kind of similarly, it talks about as well, and this is in the Daily Telegraph also, how they have strong concerns over the bill and they do not believe that the Scottish Government has considered the full impact it will have, particularly on women and girls, it says. So I don't think that issue is being lost necessarily because it is being talked about today. For example, it did get approved only yesterday And yesterday was all about how it was approved, the new rules, etc. And it was kind of like a trans celebration, is which I've seen on social media. Where today it's gone the opposite. They're realizing, what effect is this going to have on people?
Yeah, it's funny that for listeners of maybe an older generation, not maybe, almost certainly an older generation who remember the late MP Tam DL, they would have said this isn't exactly what he called a West Lothian question, which essentially was how come Scottish MPs will be able to vote in Scottish for Scottish laws and English laws, whereas English MPs would only be allowed to vote for English laws, that kind of thing, even though they both represent the Westminster Parliament. Anyway, this is a different perspective, slightly different perspective on that. But you can imagine how people will be looking at this and thinking, this is part of the sort of power struggle between Holyrood and Westminster, ongoing power struggle as to, who gets to make the big decisions in the country, not least about independence, as we know that how challenging that issue has been, but about fundamental rights as well. This is which Parliament is sovereign. I don't want to lose sight of the issue, but I do wonder if this is going to be the more sort of existential challenge for both parliaments and both sets of politicians. Anyway, let's leave that to one side. And it is interesting that the way that you've gone through the paper's front pages on this, because I suppose it's an issue that none of them could really avoid, But anyway, we'll come back to this another time. There's another paper's story or front page story that you want to talk about as well. What is it?
Yes, Dalton. So it's flu season, unfortunately, and we just thought we got over COVID, but there has been a severe rise in the flu cases, and this is covered in a couple of the papers. So the Telegraph says hospitals facing dark Christmas for flu, and the Times saying got a cough or cold, stay away from grandparents as flu rise.
Yeah.
Families told to avoid vulnerable relatives if they have symptoms. And I mean, it just feels like the last 2 or 3 years we were avoiding our grandparents because of COVID. And it felt like it was finally over. I know personally I felt like, okay, COVID's finally over. And now we've got this fear of the flu and whether I can actually give my granny a hug this Christmas.
Well, that's the fascinating story, isn't it? The Times one, with no disrespect to the Telegraph, as much as I would like to say, well, the Telegraph is very sober about this story, etc. It's the Times one, which is somewhat flippant, you could say. Got a cough or cold, stay away from grandparents. It's not quite as simple as that. As flu cases rise, families told to avoid vulnerable relatives if they have symptoms, you say. I just wonder whether that's not the real issue, that we're coming together for the first Christmas since the pandemic, essentially. First sort of post-COVID Christmas, and yet COVID hasn't gone away. How different will this Christmas be, Niamh?
Yeah, well, you're right. So it does feel like this Christmas, with the way they're portraying it, is not going to be much different. So the reason this is all coming around is in the article further, it says how the hospital admissions have doubled in the last 2 weeks, and that the hospitals are braving for the worst Christmas in a decade, as it's been the highest level in 5 years. But a lot of this is obviously down to the fact the last 2 years we've all been cooped up with COVID. People's immunities are down. Obviously, the plunge in temperatures. It was freezing last week, very, very cold. And this is all having an impact. Now, in the Times as well, it does mention, it says how the UK Health Security Agency has urged anyone with symptoms to stay at home over Christmas, advising them to wear a mask in enclosed spaces such as trains and supermarkets, and saying how it is important to avoid contact with other people if you're unwell to help stop infections spreading over the Christmas and New Year period. But despite COVID and despite the whole masks and everything as well, it kind of goes back to common sense that if you do have the flu, I think we all naturally stayed away from each other anyways because you didn't want to catch it, whether that is with a bug, a flu, a cold or COVID.
You see, this is why your generation are geniuses. You're absolutely right. Some of us wiser olders are liable to forget that, yeah, once upon a time, that would have been standard, wouldn't it? Mate, you got the flu. Don't come into work. I shouldn't have to tell you this, but it's no laughing matter. I know it's not, but you're absolutely right. What's happened? You know, why would you have to be told? You've got the flu. You've got the sniffles. Look what we've been through the last couple of years. Stay away. And if you're not staying away from me, I'm flipping staying well away from you. That's what this story is about, isn't it? It's actually warning us, the others, you know, the innocent bystanders or the innocent victims of people who won't observe the new protocol, who won't stick to the script. It's warning us, mate, if you even see anybody sniff, stay clear. Tell them to clear off, you know? You could read it that way, couldn't you?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's in big, bold writing in the Times saying, got a cough or cold, stay away from grandparents. And without sounding maybe a little bit mean, I'm kind of like, well, yeah, obviously, if you've got a flu, stay away. And my God love her, my poor Nana has the flu at the minute. And she's not too bad, thankfully. But she said at the door when I was bringing her groceries, she's like, oh, don't come too near. I don't want to pass it to you. I was like, do you know what? You're absolutely right. I'm going nowhere near you. I'll throw this orange over to you.
But you didn't say that to your poor Nana, did you? You didn't.
Absolutely not.
You're absolutely right. Your poor Nana. What she has to put up with from the younger generation. Dear, oh dear. I'm starting to feel for her. But in the Times, the inference is that if, you know, we've got a cold, the younger generation, that we should protect our olders, whereas, yeah, it could be the other way around. One more story to talk about, and you want to talk about the biggest increase in rail fares, and that's in the Times. Keen observers will know that every year at this time, the rail fares go up. That's just standard by now. It's just, you expect them to go up, whether it be 5% or whatever it is. And this year's no different. Why is this a story then?
Yeah, absolutely. Like you said, they do go up every year, and it's usually at the start of January. But because it's hitting a massive increase, the biggest increase fare since 2012, which will be a maximum of 5.9%, they're not going to be implementing this now until March, which may be a bit of a relief for people after Christmas when they're financially. But I thought this was an interesting story as well, Dotun, because just talking about the rail fares, and obviously I'm a student, I'm 20, and all my friends were going home for Christmas, and I'm back in Ireland now, thank goodness. And my flights to Ireland were cheaper than all of my friends' rail fares back home in the UK. That is crazy in my opinion.
Yeah, in Greta Thunberg's opinion as well. I did say there is a huge divide, isn't it, between one generation and another generation. There's no way to get across to your side of the water by rail at the moment, but I don't doubt that there will be. I've been across the what they call the Östersund Bridge in the south of Sweden that links the south of Sweden to Denmark, and it's a good few miles across the waterway. I suppose that's the longest over water bridge in the world, actually, but no doubt, you know, that again will be standard at some point or other, won't it? And I can see a bridge, you know, people laughed at Boris Johnson when he was suggesting something. I can certainly see some way of getting across that isn't air, but at the moment, how else would you? Oh, boat, of course, boat. Yeah, is that? Yeah. Is that a viable option? Is that a viable
To an
option?
extent. So for me personally, I'm living in Salford, and I was coming back to Donegal in Ireland, and I fly into Derry usually, and then just drive across the border over to Donegal. But if I was to get the boat, I'd have to drive or somehow get the whole way to Liverpool, which will take me about 2 hours, and then it's 8 hours on the boat, and then the boat drives in Belfast, so it'd be another 2 to 3 hours to actually get home. So overall, you're traveling for a full day rather than if I was to get a flight, it's 30 minutes in the air and you're down again, and I'm back on home turf and back to a lovely cooked dinner as well, which I was rushing for.
Yeah, maybe it's a bit too far for a bridge. Yeah, it's a bridge too far, I think. If it's 8 hours by boat, I think it might just be a little bit too far for a bridge. Maybe Boris Johnson got it wrong after all. For some reason, I was like comparing it to that bridge from Sweden to Denmark and thinking, well, if they can do it, we can do it. You know, whatever they can do, we can do. How's the song go again? Anything you can do. But on a serious note, though, this story tells you so much, actually, about what people have to put up with, even in the cost of living crisis. Not only do rail fares have to go up, and you have to consider that when we're in the middle of a rail dispute, but also that they're considering delaying the increase for 3 months. That is only a drop in the ocean, to be frank, when people are struggling. However, it is a consideration. It does show that even these big rail companies are aware that they need to look good PR-wise, at the very least, when they're about to put up rail fares in the midst of a financial crisis.
Yeah, I think you're right. And I think PR wise, it possibly isn't going the best for them at the moment, despite all that, because obviously the headline is the biggest increase in rail fares. And I'll go by my social media, and
Right.
as I says, my social media and everybody going home at the minute, it's like strike, and then that's leading to trains being cancelled, trains being delayed. There's trains not showing up sometimes, and most people's social media is just complaining about it. Let's be honest. So PR wise, maybe they should look into it a little bit more.
I think you're so right. I tell you, you youngers are geniuses. You are absolutely right, Neve. That is it. Their PR can't be going too well. Not if they end up with that headline, the biggest increase, the biggest bit. It's just a lot, you know. They could have said, oh, 7%, increase or whatever the increase was. They could have said that, and that would have got them out of the problem. That would have been good PR, or not as bad PR. And I'm not making light of this. I generally am not, but I am very well impressed in your of your insight into this, which I didn't really think about in that way. Yeah, it would have been better if they'd had some other sort of PR point of view. So the PR company will get on your case rather than mine. Do you mind me telling them where in Ireland you are?
Absolutely not. I'll say Cork, even though this is the furthest from a Cork accent they can find. I'll put them completely off.
Have a great Christmas.
You too, Dotun. Have a beautiful time with your family and friends.